Okay, so welcome to the first video lecture for Philosophy 1113. And so just to begin, the class is called Philosophy. We're starting with Plato's Republic. Socrates, obviously famous, as often considered not the first Greek philosopher, but one of the famous Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle. So what exactly is philosophy? What does that mean as it began in ancient Greece in particular? And Thales, a guy named Thales of Miletus, is often considered to be the first Greek philosopher, and his basic thesis was that all things were made of water, or all things came from water. That may not sound especially philosophic or scientific to us today, but the idea is that he was trying to explain the world using reason, and that's really the key to philosophy. Sometimes people say, well, my philosophy on child rearing, or my philosophy on business, or whatever. And depending on what they mean, if they say my philosophy on raising children is I do it the way that my parents did, well, there's not a lot of reason there. There's not a lot of rationality there. There's not a lot of reasoned argument. They're just doing what tradition tells them, what an authority their parents tell them. That's not really philosophy in the sense that we're using it in this class. In the sense when we talk about Socrates or Plato. Philosophy, it's obviously an attempt to make sense of the world using reason, really focused on reason, and I mean the syllabus talks about that some. So Thales said that the world was made of water, that all things came from water, and he came up with the reasons for it. He didn't rely on myth, he didn't rely on Greek religion, he didn't rely on the poets who were sort of the major religious authorities at the time. He used reason to argue for the view that all things came from water. And so that's sort of, again, philosophy trying to make sense of the world, trying to describe the world, trying to make sense of people, trying to establish, and this is kind of where Socrates was somewhat more innovative, trying to establish how people should live using reason and reason alone. And one of the sort of things that Socrates did, ancient Greek philosophy often divided into the pre-Socratics, the people who came before Socrates, and then Socrates and his student Plato and Plato's student Aristotle. Why was Socrates such a turning point? For many reasons. One of them is that Socrates, a lot of the ancient Greek philosophers, they were focused very much on what we might call cosmology, trying to understand the universe, where did it come from. Their writings, they don't always survive in complete form, but their writings are often very poetic, may even seem somewhat religious. So part of it is that they were, of course Socrates didn't write anything, part of it is that they were focused on these broader questions, and Socrates focused much more, not exclusively certainly, but Socrates, and of course most of what we know about Socrates comes from his student Plato, who wrote dialogues. Another student named Xenophon also wrote dialogues featuring Socrates, and he also appears in a comedy by the Athenian playwright Aristophanes called The Clouds. But if we're looking at Plato, Socrates talked about all the things that the pre-Socratic philosophers talked about, but focused much more as well on philosophy, bringing reason to bear on how people should live, and on what is right, what is the best form of political organization, which is what the Republic is about. And so, asking these questions that the pre-Socratics didn't answer, did not ask nearly as much, and that's, of course, part of why he got into trouble. He was much more controversial than most of the pre-Socratics, and was ultimately, of course, put to death by Athens. So again, just more kind of background. Socrates is the first philosopher. Again, not the first philosopher. Again, there were philosophy in other traditions go back hundreds of years. You could even argue thousands of years before Socrates. Even in ancient Greece, there were philosophers before Socrates. But one of the things that changed so much with him is that he began to focus more on moral and political questions, as well as questions of cosmology, or what we might call metaphysics. In Plato's Apology of Socrates, where he kind of describes how he got his start as a philosopher. It's kind of an odd story. A friend of his went to the oracle at Delphi, and the oracle was supposed to speak for the god, in this case the god Apollo. There's evidence now that there was actually a crack in the earth behind the temple, and maybe they would go back there and inhale the fumes that were coming up, and sort of be inspired that way, and sort of go out then and speak, feel the god speaking through them. And there was a sort of much more dramatic one where you could go and actually ask the god a question, and the god would answer, though usually this is where the term oracular comes from, the word oracular, that the answer was not always extremely clear or straightforward, or to the point, but that was sort of the more dramatic version, where you could actually go and ask the god what is going to happen here? What should I do here? Then there was the more much kind of simpler, almost kind of the bargain version, where you could just ask a yes or no question, and the oracle would take out. Oh, the oracle had the priestess had 2 jars in front of her, one of white pebbles, one of black pebbles. The white pebbles meant yes, the black pebbles meant no. One of Socrates' friends, who was a very excitable person, went and asked, is anyone wiser than Socrates? And the oracle pulled a black pebble. No, no one is wiser than Socrates. And Socrates' friends went back, and his friend went back and told him that. And Socrates was convinced that the god was wrong. And in the way he presents it in the Apology of Plato, it's almost kind of comic. He says, as an act of piety, as an act of devotion, he had to prove Apollo wrong and prove that there were other people who were wiser than him. And so he focused on some of the most notable people in Athens, the great politicians, the great poets, powerful, famous, well-positioned people. And he says what he did was he went and he would ask them what they thought they knew about, and then he would ask them follow-up questions, and often show that, or actually he says always show that they didn't really know what they thought they did. Their answers on inspection, if they were challenged, if they were asked to explain, they would have to admit that they really didn't know why they thought what they did, their different beliefs were contradictory, incompatible. And Socrates says, I started to notice that I was being hated, but I had to keep going. I had to keep this active devotion to the god Apollo. I had to prove him wrong. That was my devotion. That was my piety. And eventually he says, well, actually, it turns out no one really knows what they're talking about. And the god was right. Although I, Socrates, don't know anything, I at least know that I don't know anything, whereas all of these other people think that they know something when they don't. And how do I know that they don't know it? Because they can't give a rational account of their beliefs. They can't explain why they believe what they do and why their beliefs are consistent, again, when they're examined using reason. So this is sort of Socrates, sort of what he did much more distinctively. Most of the other pre-Socratics, were much more otherworldly, kind of off to themselves. Socrates, as that story suggests, much more confrontational and sort of obviously, again, sort of brought philosophy into the city and made it sort of part of, again, a much more confrontational part of life in ancient Athens. And so we'll see some of that right away in the Republic. As for ancient Greece, the time period that we're talking about here, roughly the 5th century BC, so about 500 years before Christ, before the Common Era, and so we're talking about 2,500 years ago is when Socrates lived, the 5th century in ancient Athens. In ancient Greece, the city was really the primary form of political organization. So it would be as if Lawton was its own country, actually, and Oklahoma City was its own country, and Wichita Falls was its own country. If these things were totally autonomous, and then you would have a larger culture. So in ancient Greece, obviously Greece was a larger culture. There was a common language, common religion. So cultural similarities among these different cities, but the city was the real unit of political organization and the real object of loyalty. So Socrates was an Athenian. And yet, we see very early on he's not overly committed to Athenian patriotism. He doesn't see things through the lens of Athenian patriotism. At the very beginning, there's sort of 2 different processions or shows that he's seen, acts of piety, and he judges the foreigners to be just as good as the Athenians. So in that way, historically, Athens was sort of the focus of identity and loyalty and so on, but Socrates is much more open-minded, much less bound in that way, though this is this was very controversial. At the time, cosmopolitanism was seen largely as a bad thing. You were supposed to have a particular identity, live in a particular place, and have a particular set of loyalties, including religious loyalties, although it was very complicated. In the Apology, Socrates is accused of saying that the sun is not Apollo, it's just a rock, and he says, well, everybody can buy these readings here in Athens, these writings here in Athens. This is a common argument that we've all heard before. So it was out there. Socrates did something that really upset people, and they attributed this to him, and they prosecuted him for that. And the official charge was not believing in the gods of the city, but introducing strange new daimonia, kind of a godlike thing, sort of something in between people and gods. And then the other part of the charge was corrupting the youth, and we'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing is the other one of the characters that we'll meet shortly is Thrasymachus. He's a sophist. What is a sophist? A sophist was someone who would travel around ancient Greece teaching for pay, and what they would teach was rhetoric, how to be successful in a political assembly, how to influence people in that way. Sort of like a lobbyist who will just represent any group for money and be very successful, kind of like the worst attitudes or stereotypes that people have about lawyers. People very clever, very effective, but very unprincipled. And that was the view of Sophists. Again, the fact that they traveled around, that they didn't, I mean, they were obviously from a particular city, but they didn't stay in that city, they didn't have that kind of loyalty, they didn't have that kind of identity. That made them very suspect. Again, cosmopolitanism, not actually a positive in ancient Greece. It made you kind of dubious or suspicious. And Socrates spent his whole life in Athens, so he wasn't a sophist in that way, and he never taught for pay. That's something he's very emphatic about in the Apology. The sophists mainly, and maybe even exclusively, taught only for pay, but mainly they taught people how to speak and so on in return for money. Socrates says, well, first of all, I never really had students. If people wanted to listen, they could. I wasn't out there teaching, trying to produce students or anything. But if anybody listened to me, I never charged them. I never taught for pay, unlike the Sophists. So another important difference. But that's sort of some of the background of what we're seeing here in the Republic. When is it happening? Where is it happening? What kind of a world was it? What were the expectations? And of course, what does philosophy mean in this context? And then